We are in section 6.2, and the learning outcome is to explain the origin of blood cells and the role of stem cells. The blood cells are all, when I say blood cells, I mean the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They all come originally from the same stem cells. Stem cells are immature cells that have the ability to become more than one thing. The stem cells to make blood are located in red bone marrow. So the stem cells are these immature blood cells that have the potential to become any of the types of blood cells, and they are in this red bone marrow. Now this cartoon is showing you the femur, the bone that makes up the top of the leg, and here's where it hooks into the hip. And you can see all this red here is where you find the red bone marrow within the bone of at the ends of these long bones. And you see down here, there's yellow bone marrow in the shaft of the bone, and that's just fat. So that has nothing to do with making blood, but the red bone marrow is absolutely critical. And you've heard of bone marrow when, probably in the terms of a bone marrow transplant, when somebody has blood cancer, leukemia, or something like that, and they need to make new blood cells, healthy blood cells. So you want to give them stem cells, these immature blood cells, from somebody that has normal bone marrow, and you extract it from the bones in the body where you find the red bone marrow. This is kind of an extension of that same learning outcome. So I have the same learning outcome here. And what this is showing you is here's this person with their femur right there. And at the ends of the femur, at the ends of these long bones, you have red bone marrow where you find a lot of stem cells. So like I said, the stem cells are immature blood cells, and they can become multiple types of blood cells. So these blood stem cells in the bone marrow, they're showing you here that they can differentiate and become all these different kinds of cells. You don't need to know the names of those, but they differentiate further, and these cells in particular become red blood cells. There's actually 5 different types of white blood cells, and then we have the platelets. And remember, we said the platelets actually aren't cells, they're pieces of cells. So you can imagine that cell broke into these little pieces called platelets. So this picture is trying to show you that we have these stem cells in the bone marrow that have the potential to divide and become red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets. The next outcome says state the major function of the red blood cells and the importance of hemoglobin and iron. So red blood cells are the blood cells that are specialized for oxygen transport. And the reason why they can carry oxygen is because they're loaded with thousands and thousands of molecules of this protein called hemoglobin. And you can see here that hemoglobin has 4 units to that protein. And then they've got this little thing they're describing as the heme group. And to that heme group, there is an atom of iron that's attached to each one of these. So one molecule of hemoglobin has 4 atoms of iron. And iron is essential for making normal hemoglobin, and it's essential for the blood cells to be able to carry oxygen, because that's at that iron spot is where the oxygen binds. So you have to have iron to make normal hemoglobin. And so we said hemoglobin is the pigment that binds oxygen, specifically at this site where there's iron. And red blood cells are red because hemoglobin is red. And red blood cells are just packed with thousands and thousands of molecules of hemoglobin. So now if you looked at a red blood cell, they have this kind of unique shape that's called a biconcave disc. So we've got this red blood cell, but it's got kind of a dip in the center, and actually that dip is on both sides. We've got these 2 concave, like inward facing curves. These are the most abundant cells in the blood. And remember when we looked at this picture here, we've got mostly red blood cells, and then we've got many fewer white blood cells. But you can see that shape of those red blood cells is that normal red blood cell shape, that biconcave disc. The other weird thing about red blood cells, not just their shape and that they're red, but they don't have a nucleus. And we were talking about cells have a nucleus. That's where their DNA is. You need that DNA to make new cells. But remember, red blood cells, they're made from these stem cells. So these cells don't make new red blood cells. All the red blood cells come from these precursor cells. And so the red blood cell itself doesn't have a nucleus, and that makes more space inside the cell to fill it with hemoglobin. Red blood cells are just cram-packed with hemoglobin. Also, this kind of odd shape of the cell gives it the maximum amount of surface area. So oxygen has more surface through which to leave the cells and travel to the other cells of the body. Now, this is a normal blood smear, and this is what it would look like under the microscope, like you would use in a regular teaching lab or a research lab. So this is really easy to see under a microscope, and most of these cells here are red blood cells. Now, this smear has been stained with dyes, so the blood cells look like they're kind of weird colors. But the other thing you'll notice is all these red blood cells, they have kind of that light area in the center. And that's not the nucleus. That is just where it's thin, because the red blood cells are thinner in the center than they are around the edges. So it just didn't stain as much. So you can see that kind of biconcave disc shape in the red blood cells. The other thing is here you're going to notice there's a lot more red blood cells than there are white blood cells, which are these things. And these little dots are platelets. And so there's many more red blood cells than white blood cells or platelets. If we look at the life cycle of red blood cells, as they're produced, they lose their nucleus and they lose most of their organelles. So without a nucleus, they can't make proteins for cell repair. So red blood cells only live for about 120 days. They only live for about 4 months. And they're going to circulate through your body. Every minute or so, you're going to, all the blood in your body is going to circulate through your body. And then after 4 months of that, each red blood cell, each cell will die. So we're making red blood cells constantly. The old worn out cells are removed from circulation in the liver and the spleen. So as our blood cells circulate through our body, every minute, every red blood cell has to pass through the liver and pass through the spleen. And there's actually, the liver and the spleen each have the ability to, there's some special blood vessels that are kind of small, and each red blood cell has to go through, and they get kind of squeezed a little bit. So every time each blood cell runs through your body, it gets a little bit of a squeeze in your liver, a little bit of a squeeze in the spleen. And if they're starting to get old, if they're wearing out a little bit, they can pop from that little squeeze that they get. And it's kind of a natural way that the body takes care of getting rid of the old red blood cells. The liver and the spleen kind of push them to their limit, test them out a little bit, and allow them to pop and get the ones that are wearing out of circulation. And then meanwhile, new red blood cells are constantly being made from the bone marrow. So it's an ongoing process. The shape of the red blood cells, that disc shape, allows them to squeeze through the small capillaries. And we already said they have maximum surface area. So that nice round cells and the way that they look, they can get through the capillaries real easily. And there's a picture. I just wanted to show you that. The blood cells kind of squeezing through, going through the capillaries, and kind of rolling that nice round shape is an easy way for the cells to move. The next learning outcome was recall the importance of oxygen and cellular respiration. So we talked about this when we talked about cells and metabolism. So we keep saying blood's so important because it carries oxygen. But do you remember what oxygen does? So our lungs take in the oxygen. The oxygen gets into our blood, attaches to the hemoglobin. But why do we need oxygen? Hopefully you remember this equation. This is the overall equation for aerobic cellular respiration. Whereas our food, glucose, our blood sugar, plus oxygen is metabolized through many chemical reactions in every one of our cells in our body. Well, most of our cells in our body. And we're going to generate carbon dioxide waste. We're going to generate a little water. But the reason why we do this is to get energy, to get ATP. So in order to get energy out of the carbohydrates that we eat, we have to add oxygen. So all this hemoglobin is there to help us get energy out of glucose and turn it into the form of ATP. Let's see, I want to talk a little bit about some of the problems associated with red blood cells, some of the diseases associated with abnormal red blood cells or abnormal issues related to red blood cells. Everybody's heard of anemia. And when someone has anemia, it means they either have too few red blood cells or they have enough red blood cells, but not enough hemoglobin in each cell. And so the point is if you don't have enough red blood cells or enough hemoglobin, you're not going to be able to carry enough oxygen. And that's going to bring us back to this. If we eat glucose, we have carbohydrates, but we don't get enough oxygen, we're not going to make enough ATP, or we're not going to make as much as possible. The most common cause of anemia is not enough iron in our diet. And so here we have, remember when we looked at hemoglobin had to have iron in it, and the iron attached to oxygen. So if we don't have enough iron in our diet, our hemoglobin isn't maximizing the amount of oxygen it can take, and it can cause this condition called anemia. There's a specific kind of anemia called pernicious anemia. And when a person has pernicious anemia, it's due to a lack of vitamin B12. Again, a dietary thing. The B12 is needed to make red blood cells. So somebody might get pernicious anemia because of not enough B12, and they'll have too few red blood cells. And this occurs frequently in elderly people. And one of the reasons is that people might get enough B12 in their diet, but they actually can't absorb it anymore. And it's something that happens as people get older. There's a certain percentage of people you're going to lose the ability to absorb B12, even if you eat enough in your diet. So you might find people getting shots. They do injections, like I don't know how often it is, weekly injections of vitamin B12, something like that, and it prevents them from having anemia. So what's the problem with getting anemia? Well, people get really tired, and that's really the common reason why a lot of times people go to the doctor. I've just been really tired. And so one of the things that the physician might do is they might order a blood test, and they want to see, do you have enough red blood cells, and do you have enough hemoglobin? And so why would you be tired if you have anemia? And that brings us back to our overall equation of cellular respiration. You can eat enough glucose, but if you don't have enough oxygen, you're not going to be able to extract the energy from that glucose. You're not going to have enough ATP. So you're going to feel really tired. So too few red blood cells, too little hemoglobin is going to cause you to be very fatigued. The second disease I wanted to talk about was called sickle cell disease, or you might hear it called sickle cell anemia. And this is a disease of the red blood cells. It's a genetic disease, and there's a genetic defect that causes the hemoglobin to be made wrong. And having abnormal hemoglobin causes a lot of the red blood cells to no longer be these lovely little biconcave discs, but that now they look sickle-shaped, kind of moon-shaped. And you can imagine if you have red blood cells and they're all trying to squeeze through your blood vessels like this, and some are curved, that they can actually kind of clump together. They don't necessarily flow through our blood vessels as easily. So people with sickle cell anemia, first of all, might not have enough hemoglobin, so they have the fatigue associated with anemia, but they can also have all sorts of other complications like blood clots and associated problems related to that. So sickle cell disease can also be called sickle cell anemia, is due to this genetic predisposition to abnormal hemoglobin and can be a very serious and lifelong disease. So check your progress. Number one, explain how red blood cells transport oxygen. I didn't go into the carbon dioxide process, so you're not responsible for that. And why are red blood cells so well suited for gas transport? I'm going to stop right there.